Thank you for inviting me. As Peter said, I am a PhD researcher on Copenhagen Business School, and I do research within public procurement law and state aid law. So a little bit on concessions as well. Concessions are a little bigger in Denmark than in Sweden, but I mean, it's hard to beat. It's not hard to beat the Swedish level. But maybe after today you will be more interested in concession contracts. So we'll start gently out with defining what is a concession. And then I'll talk a little bit about the new directive. We haven't earlier had any legislation on concessions, but we do now. And we can discuss if there's really any changes from what we knew earlier, but we'll get to that. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we implemented the directive in Denmark. And then I'll come with a case example in the end. So hopefully you'll see that concessions are doable. It can happen. So a concession is a contract where a private operator will be given the right to perform a particular task and the earnings this may cause. So that's like the definition. And in Article 1 of the new Concession Directive, it is defined as a contract for pecuniary interest, which consists either solely of the right to exploit the work or service, or in the right to exploit the work or service, combined with some kind of payment. But there should be some kind of right to exploit the work or service. That's the important bit. Right. So when a contracting authority decides to tender out a concession contract, there are several important distinctions, and I've chosen to mention 3 of those. So first of all, you should look at what is remuneration in terms of a concession contract. We know from case law that an important distinction is whether the remuneration consists of the right to exploit, as I mentioned before. And we have a case called Gemeinte Arnhem, and in that case the court stated that if the remuneration only consists of a price, then it cannot fall under the concession directive. So that's, we know that. We already knew that from case law before the concession directive was implemented. Then the second thing that's important to look at is if the risk of operating has been conferred to the private part. And this is where we often see that mistakes can be made. So often we see from case law that the risk of operating has not really been transferred. And I'll come with a case example later, which shows exactly this. And this is a distinction which is clarified in the 2014 directive. We've seen several cases on this matter, and obviously it's been difficult for the contracting authority to set the boundary or set the line at when has a risk really been conferred or not. So the 2014 directive made this explicit. And one example is stated in recital 18 of the directive, and it says that well, what you should really look at is if the recoupment, like the gains for the investment, if this is a risk or not. So if you are sure to earn money, then you haven't been transposed of the risk for your investment. And this is probably also why we see that concession contracts are rare, and also that when they do appear, we often only get one bid or one offer for the contract. So I'd say that this is really a fine line. Yeah. Recital 12 of this directive states that the risk of operating should be outside the control of the parties, and that the risk linked to bad management, contractual defaults, or force majeure cannot alone classify a contract as a concession contract, because this should really be a part of any contractual risk. So you cannot say that the risk of bad management would expose the economic operator of a risk, not when you talk about concessions. So this is a distinction you should make as well. Rather, it's important to assess whether the economic operator is exposed from a risk from the market, which means supply or demand risk. So if you build a parking lot and the risk is if there's really a demand for parking, then you cannot be remunerated like with a fixed price for the parking to make up for the lost demand, if you could say so. So a good example of a concession would be if a private operator builds a parking lot and risk that nobody comes to park there really. So that could be a practical example. And Recital 12 is really just a codification of case law, and I'll get back to this later. But this is really just what we've already known from case law, really. Right. Then we turn to talk about the duration of the contract. And this is where the Concession Directive really is explicit from the classic directive, because we don't really, the directive doesn't really mention any explicit duration of contracts, but it simply states in Article 18 that the duration of concession shall be limited. And then it's really up to the contracting authority to assess how long the contract should be valid. And this is where I see a possibility really for the contracting authority, because yes, it's a risk that you don't have any explicit rules, but it's also an opportunity for the contracting authority to have longer contracts, really. So the directive states that if the contract is lasting more than 5 years, then probably you have to, as a contracting authority, you'd have to explain why you chose as you did. And the important thing to look at really here is whether or not the economic operator will be able to recoup its investment during the period. So let's say that we have a contract which is valid for 20 years, and you can prove that the economic operator will have earned its investment within 10 years, then probably the economic or the contracting authority will have some explaining to do as to why the last 10 years needs to be valid as well. Yeah, and we'll see that with a case example from Denmark later also. And we see in the directive that it's explained really that the reason why you need to limit the contract period is, as it is in the classic directive as well, that you need to avoid foreclosure of the market. So, I mean, this is classic from the other public procurement directives as well, that we need to make sure that free movement is not hindered and the market is not closed for operators. And the directive talks quite a bit about access to the market for smaller businesses. So SMEs need to have access to the market as well, and it won't be possible really to make just really long-term contracts. And also, I think that you could have issues with state aid as well if you have really long-term contracts without really being able to explain it. But that's another story. But really, the reason why you have such a vague formulation in the directive could be that, well, this is a new area. We haven't had specific rules on this area earlier. So perhaps the member state needs some time to adjust. But it could also be that concession contracts are difficult to define. So you can't make similar rules for all concession contracts. So the contracting authority needs to have some kind of space for deciding, really. But we could imagine, I think, case law in this area, that the court would come out and have an opinion about specific cases, and then perhaps in a couple of years we'll see codification on the case law. That could easily be imagined. But as it stands now, we have the contracting authority has rather free hands when it comes to duration, and this means that you could really do what you want as long as you will be able to explain it. So that's what I see as a big opportunity for the contracting authorities if they wish to perform concession contracts. Right. So, right. I now turn to talk about why we need a directive on concessions, and there's a bit of an academic debate here that I won't go too deep into, but it can be stated that we don't really need a specific directive in this area, but let's see. So in 2014, the concession directive came into force. And this was after many years of absence of clear rules in this area. Earlier, you just had some rules that were spread out in the directives, but now we have clear rules and they are gathered in one directive. And the main reason behind it, the directive, was the increasing need for legal certainty, really. And we saw also in case law that there were too many things that the contracting authority, there were too many areas where they didn't know how to act. And also the Commission saw the need for expanding the access to the market, really, as I already talked about. So that was the reason behind, that's what the directive states as the reasons behind the need for a directive. The intention is that the directive should be clear and flexible and not create too many obstacles for the member states. So the intention with the directive is really that you should get a really flexible regime, that the contracting authority could use a little more light than with the classic directive. And as I mentioned before, there's a debate about whether or not we need a specific directive for this. And that debate really goes on, that or talks about that you could easily have just put the concession rules into the classic directive, and really many of the rules in the concession directive looks like the negotiated procedure, where you also have some flexibility, but you have to publish an award notice and so on. But I mean, that's the debate, and the reality is that we have a new directive and it's in force. So yeah, that's what we have to work with. Right. So in Denmark, we implemented the directive directly into Danish law by way of a public act in bekendtgørelse. So we just took the rules and used them directly as they are. And it turns out that Denmark has quite some experience with concessions under the old directive, but very limited experience under the new directive. And the same applies for Sweden, I could see when I did the search. But what I did find out was that our friends in France, they use the concession directive quite a lot, and they use it for a variety of tasks. So when we search on it, you could see that they have offered contracts under the concession directive relating to port operation service, childcare day service, and drinking water distribution, just to name a few. And I was curious to find out what it was that they saw. Why do they use it so much? I wasn't able to find out, but maybe they have found something that we haven't in Denmark or Sweden, but I think I have to dig a little bit more into that to see if we are missing something. But perhaps it could be, what I saw was that many of the contracts were very long. So maybe that's what they saw, that they could make a contract and then have a long duration. It could also be that France would be interested in putting private money into their public sector, and this could be a good way of doing that. Yeah, but this is the picture, nevertheless. Right. So I turn now to talk about the case example that I brought from Denmark, and the case I'm going to talk about is decided under the 2004 directive, and really what they talk about in the case is whether or not the contract is a concession contract, and the Danish National Authority, they don't really want to say too much about this issue, but I've made some links between this case and the new directive, so hopefully you can see the distinctives there. So this was a Danish case decided before the Danish National Complaints Board, and the question was whether or not a given contract could be defined as a concession. The contract dealt with development and construction and also operation of nearshore wind mills in Denmark. And the contracting authority was the Danish Energy Agency, and they considered the contract to be a public work concession under the 2004 directive. And the contract had a duration of 25 years, so that was quite long. And it also actually had a possibility to prolong the contract as well, so at least 25 years and possibly more. And the remuneration consisted of a fixed price, a quite large fixed price, and the possibility to sell surplus production of the energy on the electricity market. And in the tender documents, the contracting authority promised a very predictable income. So they tried to lure some economic operators in by making sure that, or by promising that they would actually earn some money. Right, and then the National Complaints Board received a complaint stating, among other things, that the contract could not be considered a concession, mainly because of the guaranteed income, and then also because of the non-existing risk, or at least they said, the non-existing risk at the market. And finally, the identified risk was not really risk per se, because they weren't outside the control of the parties. So that's what the case was about. And the National Complaints Board did not decide specifically on the matter because they said the contract had not been awarded by the time of the complaint, so they weren't really able to assess the risks they felt. So they didn't decide on it, but they did give quite some guidance on the matter. And regarding the argument about non-existing risk, the complaint board referred to Krankentransportstadler, which is known case law, and stated that the risk of economic operation must be understood as the risk of exposure to vagaries of the market. So that's the demand and supply risk I talked about before. The formulation from Krankentransportstadler is actually now what we see codified in recital 20 of the directive, as I also explained about earlier. And in this specific case, it was discussed whether there was an actual risk of demand because the economic operator could always sell the overproduction on the electricity market. So they had it was stated that the demand risk was that they had to sell the overproduction at the market. But the complaining company argued that this was not an actual risk because the seller would always be secured some kind of level in the price. So let's say that there was an overproduction in the Danish national electricity market, which made the price go down. Then the operator could also always take the electricity and sell it on the European market at market level. So, and that price would never really go down, they argued. So the risk was too vague, really, was what the complaining company said. And in the case, the complaints board didn't actually decide on the matter, but as I read it, they tend to believe that there isn't a risk. So this makes me think that, I mean, the risk should be there, but if we read this case, it's limited really how much of a risk there need to be. Right. So now I turn to talk about the argument about the duration. And I mentioned earlier that the duration of the contract was 25 years, which was quite excessive. And again, the complaints board did not address it specifically, but you can make some arguments or some comments regarding the new directive and the new rules I talked about before. First of all, it's important to remember, as I said before, that no specific rules are expressed in the directive, which means that, in theory, 25 years duration could be all right. If the contracting authority could somehow prove that the economic operator is not able to recoup their investment within the period. the specific case actually talked quite a bit about this. And it turned out that the contracting authority had a consultancy firm of some kind to actually calculate what kind of level of investment would generate any level of profit. So they just compared that if you invest this amount, then you will recoup your investment within this and this year. And they made a fine calculation of that. And it showed that in many cases, the economic operator would actually be able to recoup their investment before the 25 years had passed. And the complaints board didn't decide on the matter, but they just stated what was the rules at that time. But if you have to make a translation into the new directive, then this would not be okay. If you could somehow prove that the economic operator would be able to recoup the investment within the 25 years, then probably the court wouldn't accept that long a contract. But it's uncertain because we don't have any case law, and the directive is quite unexplicit on the matter. So there could also be a question of how many economic operators could actually be able to recoup the investment within the 25 years, and would it be enough if only one economic operator weren't able to recoup the investment? We simply don't know it. But this case clearly shows that, well, first of all, the directive has made some changes according to what we knew earlier, and especially in the Danish case here, I think that if the complaints board had decided on the matter under the new rules, then probably there would be some problems. That's my best belief anyway. So that was a case example from case law in Denmark, and I also know about concession contracts for parking lots, as I talked about before, and also I know a contracting authority who built a canteen, and in that contract there was also the issue about the risk of operating. So is the contracting authority allowed to build the kitchen, to buy all the equipment for the kitchen, and secure a steady level of employers who buy at the canteen every day? Those could be some of the things that you would have to consider as a contracting authority when you do concessions. But as I also stated before, there are also possibilities because of the quite flexible regime, really. So my belief is that it could be a good idea to make a concession if you would be sure that anyone would actually make a bid. And I guess it's all about time, really, that yeah, you just have to get started with it, perhaps. I mean, that's the best I could say. So I talked a lot, but do you have any questions regarding, was it clear what a concession is? Hmm? Yeah. 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 Yes. Yeah. 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 Yes. Yes. I agree. Yeah. 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 And I agree that you should definitely take into consideration what type of contract. And this is exactly why they can't make any explicit rules. But my belief is that we will see case law from the EU courts on this matter, because this is really quite flexible. So they'd have to give some guidance on this matter, really. And in the Danish example, the 25 years, I mean, if the court accepted the arguments that the economic operator could recoup within the 25 years, then probably would see a case on that. Yeah, but I agree. Yeah. Normal contract. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and it's quite a good question actually, because you're not the only one who noticed that, and that was what I talked about with the academic debate. But yes, I mean, there is a difference, because you'd have to transfer some risk on the economic operator, and that's really where the difference lies. So that there would have to be a risk for the economic operator to actually gain their investment, which makes it very insecure for the contracting or the public authority. But that's really the distinction, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. 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 Yeah, definitely. And I have two comments to what you say. And the first is that really the concession contract looks a lot like the negotiated procedure. So maybe I didn't highlight that enough, but that's really also a strong part of the concession contract, that you can actually talk to the economic operator, and also in terms of innovation. So if the contracting, I remember when I was a procurement lawyer, and you had to do a tender for something that a market that you didn't really understand. You hadn't operated on the market before, and you had to start from scratch by defining the market. And I mean, what concession can do is that, well, you can talk to the economic operators who actually know something about the market, and you're allowed to do that in a higher degree than under the classic directive. Yeah.